Good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us for NASCA's Summer Thought Leadership Series. We're thrilled to see so many folks dialing in this morning. We've got folks still coming in and dialing in to join us, but welcome. For those of you who have been with us, this is week 2 of our Summer Thought Leadership Series. We've had a wonderful opportunity to engage with you, to hear from different colleagues from across the country, and we're just so excited to have you back with us here today. We have a wonderful opportunity today to talk around human capital and specifically around overtime and how the pandemic response has impacted some of the work states are doing with their employees in state government operations. Just a few quick housekeeping tips for you before we kick off today. If you'll make sure you let us know that you're here with us, hover over your name, find where it says rename, put your name and your state or your company, just so that we can identify you. And you can see our example here, Jamie Rogers, Kentucky. Just, again, jump in really quickly and hover over your name and rename yourself. We're going to be using an engagement tool today called Slido. If you've been with us for the other sessions of our Thought Leadership Series, you know how easy this is to use. Go ahead and pull up your Android or Samsung or iPhone and type in slido.com. The code is NASCA20, or you can use your QR reader or your camera and pull this up on your phone as well. Our speakers are going to be turning to Slido several times during their conversation today, so make sure you pull that up. We love to see your comments. Drop notes in chat. Go ahead and meet each other that way. You can use physical affirmations saying hello, thumbs up. Yes, we're so excited. We love what you're hearing. Share those takeaways in the chat as well. We also have our community forum, which we want you to engage with all of your colleagues post-event. And in your information that you received from NASCA, you have a way to access that, or you can go directly in from our website as well. We want to see your faces. It's so nice, again, because we know we can't be together in person, but we want to see your faces. So turn your cameras on. Let's see who's here with us and just make sure we can see your reactions to some of the conversations we're having. Go ahead and mute yourself, though. We do want you to unmute yourself when we're in our breakout sessions following our presentation. That'll give you an opportunity to engage and network, but for now, let's all stay muted just so we can hear our speakers. As well, we can't put on this series without our corporate council members and our supporters of our events. You can see here all of our wonderful members that have come to NASCA to say this information is critical, and we want to support you for that. So again, if you have an opportunity, say a quick thank you to any and all of our sponsors for being with us here today. We have a Twitter contest. It's gaining some momentum. Folks are getting excited. There's a surprise gift that will be coming your way. So take out your Twitter account. Make sure you capture a picture of what you're seeing on your screen, or tweet a little nugget that you hear from our speakers today. Use both hashtag NASCA20 and NASCA.org. Just, again, take an opportunity to share a thought or an experience or a photo. We will be announcing the Twitter contest winner before we close this morning. And also, I just want to make sure we do a special shout out to our virtual event working group. These state leaders and our corporate council members came together and really helped guide the content and the flow that you're seeing here over these 3 weeks. So again, just a special thanks to them for coming together to help NASCA team. So again, we're so excited to have you here. We've got wonderful speakers today, a great lineup. We've got our Kentucky studio with Jamie Rogers, our Deputy Director, and Kayla Leslie, our Project Coordinator. We've got our Virginia studio with Scott Wayne and his entire team. And then I'm in the Greenville studio today. So excited to join you from multiple places on the East Coast. And again, thank you so much for dialing in and joining with us today. At this point, let me turn over the mic and the camera to our treasurer, our NASCA Executive Committee Treasurer, Scott Bollinger from South Dakota. So Scott, we'll let you take it away.
Thanks, Pam, and good morning, everybody, and welcome to NASCA's Summer Thought Leadership Series. It's great to see so many dialing in. I think the last time I checked, we're exceeding 70, so great numbers again today. And it's great to see the faces of people that are involved in NASCA, and both on the public and private side. It really gives us an opportunity to touch base again in this difficult time. We've heard from many thought leaders throughout this series, and today will be another exciting session for everybody. Make sure you're taking advantage of the opportunity to engage with our colleagues and those on these pressing topics and learn about what's being presented. And as you have questions, don't hesitate to ask. Lean on your colleagues to share their experiences, learn from their ideas, utilize the breadth of NASCA to exchange those ideas and even connect more so in a virtual situation. We'll be together again soon, but for now, let's use the time to find those nuggets that can help us all out and share experiences and learning to transform state government operations. And also let me echo Pam's comments and take a moment to personally thank our corporate counsel, for continuing to assist NASCA when it's, we ask them for their resources on a regular basis, and for them to step up and help us out has been fantastic. I also want to recognize the Thought Leadership Group, working group, because they're the ones that put all this together and looked at what was prevalent at this particular time, so we can all learn from each other. Let's get started with today's presentation and hear from our speakers as they discuss the great overtime dilemma. And again, engage with your colleagues and share what's going on with your state. Today, we'll hear from Catherine Barrett and Richard Green from Barrett and Green, along with Linda Misigadis from Kronos. Catherine is a principal at Barrett and Green and co-author of the recently released study titled Making Government Work: The Promises and Pitfalls of Performance-Informed Management. She's a columnist for several prominent media outlets, a visiting fellow at IBM Center for the Business of Government, and a consultant to the National Association of State Personnel Executives. Richard is also a principal at Barrett and Green. He collaborated with Catherine on the Making Government Work document and also serves as a columnist for many prominent outlets. He is a fellow in the National Academy of Public Administration and chair of the Center for Accountability and Performance of ASPA. Linda is a public sector industry consultant for Kronos. She brings more than 20 years of experience in both private and public sector. She is a certified payroll professional, certified public manager, and certified chance manager. She comes to Kronos after working at the City and County of Denver and serves on a volunteer board for the Association of Change Management Professionals. Panel, I'll turn it over to you to share your thoughts with us and look forward to hearing what you have to say. Thank you.
Good morning, everyone. We're excited to be here. Rich is going to kick things off and talk a little bit about overtime, and we're hope that will be a very interactive session, and we'll have an opportunity to hear from you as well to get your thoughts.
May or may not be germane to the conversation. After the very nice introduction from Scott, is that in addition to our various joined efforts across cities, states, counties for the last 30 years, we're also married to each other. So to the extent that we sit a little too close, no notes, it's legitimate. We'll stick close together even after this is over. I think it might be a good idea to kind of just start, and I'll handle this because I'll be doing a little bit less of the talking later on, to talk about some data-based ideas that we discovered in putting together the paper about overtime. The first thing probably worth talking about is just a major part of the reason why Kronos, NASCA, the two of us joined forces in exploring this topic, is that there's been a meteoric rise in overtime costs. I said earlier on, Catherine and I have been at this city, state, county field for 30 years. Overtime's always been an issue. Overtime always probably will be an issue because it's very complicated. But in recent years, the increases in overtime have been dramatic. In New York City, they were higher in 2018. That's the most recent data available, than at any time in the last 10 years, according to an audit came out in 2019. So that's 2018, higher than ever before, even during periods of time when you might have anticipated a lot more overtime. Also, the New York DOT, overtime rose, you're not going to believe this, overtime rose by nearly 80% between 2008 and 2018. That's I mean, I used the word earlier on, meteoric. That's even more than that. And audits also reported a rise in overtime in countless local governments. There was a major increase in Atlanta overtime in between fiscal years 2013 and 2018, doubling to 58 million. Overtime costs during that period grew an average of 18% a year. These are just a few examples. If we wanted to, we could go down a list of cities nationwide, and you would find something perhaps not as extreme as what we've just heard about in New York, but you'll find wild increases in overtime almost every place. Overtime is frequently underestimated in the budgets, which is a real problem. So at the beginning of a fiscal year, a city or a county or a state has a budget, and the budget includes a line item for overtime, and they balance their budget. And one way to balance a budget is to underestimate one of the items in the budget. So in order to balance their budgets, many of them underestimate what overtime is going to be, because otherwise they would have to cut services. But they do have to pay the overtime, and they have to pay the overtime. And so as a result, that underestimation can leave many places caught short when it comes time to actually pay the bills they're inevitably due. Philadelphia is kind of an extreme here. It for 9 years running, as of fiscal 2019, it exceeded its overtime budget for each of nine consecutive years. There are also worth note some heavy users of overtime. Certainly it is more prevalent in certain sectors of government than it is in others. It's particularly common, and this will be intuitively true to you, it's particularly common in 24/7 operations like those related to public health and safety. You really need to have as many firefighters as you need to have. And if you don't have enough firefighters available on the regular schedules, then there needs to be overtime there. In Los Angeles, police and fire departments accounted for 77% of overtime, just those two. And 91% of fire and police department employees earned overtime. That was an average of over $27,000 per employee. But I find it kind of remarkable that you can have a system in which 91% of all the fire and police department employees were getting overtime. In New York, the highest levels of overtime in 2018 were the Office of Mental Health, the Department of Corrections, and Community Supervision, and the Office for People with Developmental Disabilities. A little more than 60% of overtime was attributable to agencies that manage institutions. I should back up, by the way, that in terms of overtime in places like these, most notably perhaps corrections, correctional officers have a tough life. They are working in perhaps the only environment known in government in which all of your patrons hate you and want to get as far away from you as they can. And so as a result, it's very easy for correctional officers to take a day off that wasn't anticipated, to do any number of things that require somebody there, because you can't have too few correctional officers in a prison and still maintain safety over the course of time. A couple more quick things. There are real risks of excessive overtime. In LA, 18 firefighters earned more than $200,000 in overtime. That's stunning, right? I mean, that's the overtime. That's not what they got paid. The other thing I want to hit on is that the cost of overtime often fails. This is yet another underestimation of what this is really costing us. Fails to include compensatory time, which is when you don't give people money, but you let them take those hours and are paid for them later on as overtime. And it creates a cascading overtime, and as such costs more down the line. So with that sort of stuff out of the way, I think what I'd like to ask our panelists to do is to talk just a little bit back and forth between yourselves, whatever's most comfortable, about why overtime is such an important issue. But before we do that, I'm going to turn to Catherine, who, again, you'll see she's smiling. She likes me. To tell a little bit about the white paper that we talked about earlier on, the great overtime dilemma.
Yeah, so I mean, we were really excited to do this project for Kronos because Rich and I have covered overtime, and I mean, we've been writing about state and local government for 30 years, and a lot of the time we focused on management, and overtime is something that has come up over and over, as Rich said. To get started on this report, what we did is we started looking at performance audits, and we were astonished at how many of them there were. Just looking at audits that had come out, and these are audits in cities, counties, and states. Over the last 2 years, we read through about 36 of them. And
these things are long.
Yes. Yeah, but they were enormously informative, and auditors see the negative things that are going on, so they were picking out the problems. And I think that what really a couple of things impressed us as we were doing our research. One was that if you look at what the auditors say, it really comes through loud and clear that overtime is a problem. It is, it's got a lot of issues in terms of, I can't think of another word, kind of sloppy management, but that there are plentiful ways in which overtime can be managed. And so that made us feel that this report could really do some good for people in looking at, where's the spots that people go wrong, what states and cities and counties go wrong, and what can they do about it? And the audits were full of recommendations. So what we did, and I'll just be really brief, it was very easy to categorize the problems in 3 different areas. And I think we have a slide that shows the 3 different areas, Scott, that we talked about.
No.
So it's the one before that, I think. Yeah, that's it. So the 3 areas were data and documentation, approval and monitoring, and staff analysis and scheduling. And just really briefly, data and documentation, we were surprised at the number of entities that are still paper-based, and where auditors found problems with erasures, whiteout. People are still using whiteout to change how they're documenting things. And sometimes the data just wasn't there. I think we came across some entities in which there was really good solid documentation of less than 25% of overtime that was used. The second category was approval and monitoring. A number of entities the auditors pointed out that people could improve their own overtime, or they could approve overtime for their supervisors or for people above them. And so that had to be paid a lot more attention to, as who was approving it, and also who was monitoring how and why it was being used, and also monitoring who was using it. And and why they were using it, and all of those led to when that was done, and when entities look at where the overtime is being used, what divisions it's being used in, and who it's being used by, then and come through with frequent weekly, even daily reports of overtime use, it can be a lot better monitored. And then the last category was staff analysis and scheduling. Rich mentioned that that 24/7 operations, 24/7 operations are ones where this occurs. There are issues with relief factors, and that in which you have to calculate how much staff you need to cover your 24 hours, and that's often incorrectly assessed. And so we found a lot of places in corrections departments, mental health departments, where it was necessary to re-look at relief factors that had been set maybe 20 or even 30 years ago. And I think that was pretty much what we found in the report.
Yeah, I think that was a great summary. Let me turn the microphone over to Linda, and frankly, to a lesser degree, to Catherine. I kind of like to hear Linda's take on this because she hasn't gotten a turn yet. So I'm very curious, Linda, if you could talk about why overtime is such an important issue. I mean, we've talked about the numbers, and you could assume it's an important issue because there's lots of it. But could you take us just one level deeper than that?
Yeah, you bet. I'm excited to be here with the two of you, and we are excited to partner with you together on this report. I can't wait for people to get a chance to read it. There's such amazing facts and just some really great data points that you all were able to find, and so it's great to be able to talk about it today. But we've really have seen such a significant overtime increase in recent years, and the pandemic is not making that any easier. And we're seeing that especially in fields that have high vacancy rates, and you all have touched on that a lot in public safety. We see this frequently, corrections, emergency medical, but we also see a lot of this in areas like a Department of Human Services, departments of public work. There's anywhere you have a high concentration of hourly workers in an environment such as government where resources are thin. After the Great Recession, everyone was challenged to do more, but do more with less. And how are you supposed to make that happen? And I think that that's a real challenge that we're seeing as well. And, I think another big piece of this is around inefficiencies in processes. So you touched on that a little bit too on the administrative side of it, that oftentimes overtime becomes out of control because no one is managing to it, no one's monitoring it. In public safety, oftentimes they have various rules and regulations around who should get overtime in order to really kind of help manage that a little bit as well. And in the absence of any real ability to track that and not have manual-based systems, it's very easy for overtime to really get out of control. So we see that. Another big piece that doesn't get talked about enough, and I think we're going to chat a little bit about that today too, is the actual impact of overtime on employees. So we talk a lot about how it impacts the budget, and that of course is something that government is challenged with all the time. But what about the people that are having to work all of this overtime? Yes, there may be some compensatory benefit to that, but honestly, you have a danger of burnout, of exhaustion. We start to see the problems, around Betsy Thomas from Georgia DOC, who's been a great partner with us. Where she says when you have officers that are working 28 days out of a 28-day cycle, it's not safe, and those officers are they might be the ones who answer the phone when you need something covered. And that's why you see such high utilization of certain employees, is those are the ones who are willing to come in. And another interesting fact really is around the effect of, the lack of sleep and the amount of time that they're spending and the impact of that. So equating that to, blood alcohol levels, and would be considered legally drunk. How frightening is that to think about people who are in jobs that require them to be sharp and fully fully there and aware, because they are maybe in dangerous situations, to be in a situation where they are fatigued or tired or just burned out. It creates a whole different environment. So I think overtime is so important, and we focus so much on it financially, but we don't often pay enough attention to the impact of overtime on our employees.
Yeah, I wanted to add to it what Linda said, and I found this really interesting that an audit in Portland, Oregon, and this was a year or two ago, suggested that excessive overtime use by police poses a risk to the relationship between the community and the police when police are overtired, overworked, and have fewer opportunities to sort of engage with the community, then community police relations suffer. And I think that's a very interesting issue to think about right now. There was also a Washington, D.C. audit that reported that excessive overtime means some district employees are working long hours on less rest, creating a higher risk of inattentiveness that can lead to injury to themselves or to others. And so I think that there are these dangers to overtime that aren't always recognized.
I think that's a really good point, Catherine, and very telling, right? Right now, with what we're seeing across the country, even more so with the impact of the pandemic, with the Black Lives Matter movement, the conversation around defunding the police, all of those things are really it's interesting, all of the data that you found and how that really kind of relates to what's happening in the world right now, right here in our own country.
Right. Well, that was just great. What a wonderful answer. Let's put up a slide if we can about pandemics, because this wouldn't be a webinar in 2020 if we didn't go to pandemics. In this particular instance, the question I'd like both Catherine and Linda to address themselves to is how is the pandemic affecting overtime? And here's your opportunity, as explained earlier on. And I really strongly encourage you. It'll be a lot of fun for everybody, especially me, if you folks out there in the audience were to make comments, longer or shorter, but just make comments. They'll appear on the screen and they'll give us fodder for further conversation. So let's just.
So yeah, it's interesting in terms of the pandemic. I don't think we really know how it's affecting overtime yet, except it's in the way that there are certain fields, healthcare, first responders, where that it's got to be affecting overtime.
Well, and Catherine, another Neil Reichenberg and I were talking about this on another webinar that we were able to participate on, and really talking about when the pandemic first happened, it was an event, right? We thought, okay, well, for a very short period of time, we're going to have to shut some things down, and we'll find a way to deal with it. And then as time has gone on and remote work has started to become less of an event and more of a way that we're now doing business and employees are working, there are also issues around compliance related to that, because you have employees who historically might have come into an office and you had some way of monitoring what was happening. When you're working from home, especially for non-exempt employees who maybe aren't used to working from home, you can oftentimes find that you think, oh, well, I'm home. I don't have anything to do with the family right now, so I'll just log onto my computer and I'll do some work. What you can end up creating are FLSA compliance risks, because now you have employees who maybe are working when they're not supposed to be working, or you can create an unintended budget consequence where now suddenly you're paying overtime to employees who you weren't intending to pay overtime to, and the intentions are good, but you know, you start to see those sorts of things happening right now as well. So I agree with you. It's going to be really interesting to see the impacts of the pandemic and what it does mean to overtime when we have a chance to really analyze some of this.
Yeah, I think the answers that are coming up are really fascinating and very apt. It's certainly going to be more difficult to manage as revenues are dropping and there's less I mean, the pandemic and the revenue downfall is requiring all sorts of attention. So concentrating on management is harder. The issue of burnout is a real issue, and everything is also very unpredictable. And it's unpredictable what's happening with the pandemic and who's going to be sick and how you need to, you know, fill in positions because of absenteeism. And then this point that someone made about the imbalance in who gets overtime is definitely an issue. Some people will have less work to do. There are layoffs. And again, we don't know how layoffs will affect overtime and the ability to manage it. I think it's interesting that if you look at how budgets are being cut right now, a lot of times, particularly with police, the line that's being cut is the overtime line. And as Rich said, that's overtime is frequently now underestimated. So cutting it in the budget is kind of an iffy proposition.
And actually, I think that I'll just throw in a thought, which is that the likelihood of there being more overtime during the pandemic, I believe, is fairly high. Leaving aside the impacts of the pandemic on people who are actually sick, there's this 2-week waiting period, and during the 2-week waiting period, for those people who are not teleworking, for those people who are in the office, they're not allowed to go into the office, and so there's 2 weeks in which you need to replace them in their jobs. And if it's a vital job, then you're going to be paying somebody overtime for it. So there's this sort of extra little bit of pain to what we're going through right now.
Yeah.
Well,
Should we move? No,
I was just going to say, Catherine, the other thing that we don't, that isn't really often thought about in this situation too, is that government services have to go on, and so employees are sometimes being required to work overtime, whether they want to work overtime or not, because at the end of the day, as constituents, as taxpayers, we still expect government services to be there. And while the pandemic is going on, it's not stopping what else is going on across the country. From, you know, we saw the power outages in New York this week. There were hurricanes. There are tornadoes that happened in New Jersey. All of these things that are happening that require government services to be in place as well. And so I think that's just another piece that kind of, you know, the pandemic has overshadowed so much of the fact that at the end of the day, government services don't get to just go away.
Yeah, and interesting, I mean, when you see answers that are coming out more frequently, burnout is really there. Burnout politics, union negotiations. I mean, I think union negotiations have been an issue in all times. But burnout really strikes me as an issue. And maybe we should go to the next topic.
Well, actually, I want to go back for a second to Linda specifically. So the biggest word up there is politics, and clearly a lot of people said that. Linda, can you help us to interpret what that political element is and why so many people think it's such a significant element of the pandemic affecting overtime?
Well, it's interesting because I think that what ends up happening is that politics get in the way of really looking at what's happening from a workforce perspective, from the reality of the situation of what needs to occur. Anyway, as we were kind of talking about that, the work needs to continue. Government services are needed even more than ever during these types of crises. We saw it during the Great Recession when we saw an increase of the need of utilization of services and Department of Human Services. Right now we're hearing a lot of this and with the pandemic as well as an increase in the need for those types of services. We've got all of these other things that are happening. We're in an election year, which also is creating its own set of challenges. There are all of these conversations around funding, and we're obviously very concerned about making sure that the private sector is taken care of, but oftentimes I think government forgets that they're an employer as well. And so states and cities and counties all are required to take care of their own employees, and oftentimes the whole notion of politics kind of gets in the way of that and causes us to lose sight of the fact that we do need to make sure that we're thinking about the workforce, the economic impact to government that the pandemic is happening as well, and how are we going to support those employees, because they're just as important to the economy as the private sector is to the economy. And so it really has been interesting to see how much all of this has become more politically motivated versus really focusing in on the issues at hand and the impact to the workforce and to the world.
I'm sure you're right about that. When we first started work on this, the very first question that we were discussing with our friends at Kronos were, how do you tell the difference between good overtime and bad overtime? Which turned out to be really kind of central to the final report. It's very rare that the first question you ask is still the question that you're interested in at the end. But Catherine, you want to tackle that?
Well, and really, I think that Linda should tackle that one too. I mean, I know that when we've looked at good overtime versus bad overtime, the issue is, there are some cases in which you save money by using overtime because you don't have the extra benefit cost. But then in other cases, you're using many more dollars than you would if you increased your staff. And then you are also endangering yourselves with the issues that we brought up before. Linda, do you want to go take that as well?
Yeah, when I think about back in my days working at the city, when, I think about the use of good overtime versus bad overtime, is that it's not as black and white as we'd like it to be in relationship to that. But if I think about good use of overtime, it's generally driven by perhaps an event that is happening. I see for critical responses only had kind of popped up. You could see that as a good use of overtime. Another time is to take a look, like I remember when the Democratic National Convention came to Denver, and the increase of overtime that we had to have there was significant, but it was for a short period of time. And so, really kind of looking at if it's an event that is driving that, it may not make sense for you to hire a lot of additional staff. We see that also during times of, the snow season in states like Colorado where we get snow, that it doesn't make sense to go out and hire a bunch of people during that period of time. So you might see an increase of overtime during that. When I start to think about a bad use of overtime is really when it's not being managed or when it just becomes routine. We see this a lot across the country as organizations really start to take a look at this, and you probably saw this in your audit reports as well, is that as you start to dig into it and realize that, and this is particularly true in a lot of public safety, unfortunately, is that, and I just see it popped up there, some employees really depend on that overtime. And so what ends up happening happening is that with the lack of management is that you create a scenario where employees now are relying on that overtime. So they're going to work overtime whether or not there really is overtime. And in the absence of any type of real management of those situations, it's easy for that to get out of control or oftentimes even overlooked. And, you know, we saw this a lot years ago, and I know we don't see it as much today, but it still exists, which is around pension padding, overtime spiking, you know, or we saw this in Baltimore where there was, you know, just excessive overtime that was being, and it's always hard to say, but you know, it's a real misuse, and that's where I look at bad overtime, is when it's really being abused, and that we're not really evaluating the situation to determine.
Yeah, I think that you've made some great points there. Just in terms of the budget savings, we remember from the audits that in Washington, D.C., when they calculated the cost of overtime, they figured out in the Department of Public Works they could save $200,000 annually by hiring more permanent employees. Same with the Department of Corrections. They figured they could save $1.4 million in personnel costs by hiring 78 more correctional workers. So, and I think also the point that you made before about routine, using overtime for routine tasks that you know are going to be there, is the overtime that you would maybe question, as opposed to things that you can't predict. You can't predict the weather. You can't predict often the, you know, events or demonstrations or things like that, where you got to use overtime.
Right, and actually, there are articles, you'll find them in mostly in smaller town publications, about how much, isn't it terrible how much the city or the county or the town spent, or the state spent on road clearing in times of big snowstorms. And when you think about that for just a second, you've got two options. One is to have enough people so that when you get to a point in time when you need a lot more people to shovel the snow, you'll be fine. But that means that the rest of the year, you're way overstaffed.
You're right, Rich, and I think that's an area that just gets is really kind of, it goes to the idea of being able to have the technology in place that didn't exist before, but it does exist today, being able to do trend analysis. And so if you can look at specific events that occurred, so we know that, you know, I always say this, that inevitably California will catch on fire. It seems to catch on fire every year. And so if you have the ability to take a look at events that you know are likely going to occur again and start to do some trend analysis around that, you can do better planning. And so then that puts you in a position to do some modeling and to figure out that when this event happens, we know that we're going to need X number of people with these types of skills, and you can make sure that, you know, you at least are in a position to be better prepared. I'm not saying that every time that, you know, it's always easy on the back end to do the analysis and say, this is what you need to do, and then the reality of the situation kicks in. But if you can do that type of work ahead of time, and you really do start to do some reflecting backwards to figure out how you can plan for the future, it does make a significant difference in what you're doing.
Right. Let's move on to a third topic, which is with remote work, which is every place in cities, counties, states, and will be for a week or a month or a year, God knows. How do you measure overtime in a way to make sure employees are not working too much or too little? Because now they're working out of their homes. Now, if it's me working out of my home, I'm going to just want to, well, actually, I have worked out of my home, and this is what I have done all these years, is after the 10th hour, I think, well, gee, just one more thing. And then after 12 hours of working, I'm exhausted. And I eat something, and then I drowse off. This is not a healthy lifestyle, but it's one that remote employees can easily fall into the trap of. So how do you data has come up, which is pretty much the answer to everything. But any other thoughts as to how we from the audience as to how to measure overtime to make sure employees are not working too much or too little? And I love manager check-ins.
And one-on-one conversations, we keep hearing this. There's a whole different way of managing when your employee is not right in front of you. And I think people have really been learning it in recent months. And generally, it's been going pretty well. It's still tricky to manage how long people are working. I guess you can have them still sign in the beginning of their work period and sign out when they finish. But Linda, what do you think?
You know, I think this one has really been challenging. And I read an article recently that said the pandemic has really put the greatest strain on human resources and IT. IT because they need to be able to have all of the technology in place, but human resources because of all of the things that are popping up on the screen here. You know, in my experience when I worked in government and really just working in general as a manager or in payroll and human resources, oftentimes managers don't know how to manage their employees. And so, you know, they know how to manage situations, they might know how to manage the work, but managing employees is a little bit different. And so having to train and provide the opportunity, one, to have the technology so that employees get used to like what we're doing here, being on screen, being comfortable with that, and spending time talking to one another, because all the technology in the world isn't going to change behavior. It is going to have to be that interaction between the employees and you know, their managers, and having those check-ins as well. It's really important right now in a remote environment where you can feel very isolated and you don't have those connections to work. And so, you know, I think that all of the things that have popped up are just so important to really doing all of this, because the overtime aspect of it becomes, you know, the smaller piece of that puzzle when it really is more important to have the impact and the conversations with your employees and those check-ins and making sure that they're okay.
Yeah.
Great. What I'd like to do now is kind of like a Rorschach test, and either Linda or Catherine can kind of jump in. I'm going to raise topics. Let's give real nice, short, to the point answers so that we can get to our Q&A. But there are some important points that haven't come up that I'd love to see discussed. I'd love to see our audience hear and learn more about. And I think that the top on the list in my mind, which I don't believe we've mentioned, is the relationship between staffing and understaffing and use or lack of use of overtime. Whichever one of you wants to jump in.
Well, I mean, I think you can hardly deny that one of the drivers of overtime over the last, say, 5 years has been the incredibly low unemployment rate, the high turnover rate, and the difficulty that many entities are having in fully staffing what they do. And so that's been driving overtime. I don't know how much we have talked about that before. And I don't really know how how the next couple of years are going to be affected by a higher unemployment rate. I think, you know, in some cases applications are going up, but will places be able to fill positions, or, you know, be able to fill positions because of the revenue drop? Linda?
I agree with you, Catherine. I do think, you know, there is a direct correlation between staffing and overtime and scheduling. So, you know, having the ability to have a better handle on that certainly does make a big difference.
Great.
So let me move on to another quick thing. Let's talk about public safety. Even though I'd like to focus a lot on what the states are doing, The fact is that the area that we find the biggest problems with overtime are in public safety, whether it's public safety, and public safety, I'm going writ large. So I'm talking about correctional officers who tend to be state employees, to police or firefighters or highway patrolmen. I guess the question I've got is, why are those public safety areas such a central concern in terms of overtime?
Well, you definitely see the highest utilization of overtime is almost always in public safety. And, I don't know if that's by design or by default that has happened, but it's a reality. And perhaps what's going on right now across the country and the focus on what is happening in police departments and fire departments and departments of corrections as we're looking at all of this really kind of plays into that conversation around public safety and the work that those officers are being required to do. So, are they being, are we really overstaffed or understaffed and overworked? Are we requiring them to do things that maybe they shouldn't be doing? I think that's such a big conversation, and it's a tough one because it's also unions play such a critical role in all of that as well. So as soon as you start to really dig into these things, the unions immediately kind of, get their hackles up, and now it changes the conversation. And so public safety has always been such a hotbed and a tough one because how do you make the decision whether or not you make those cuts or you don't make those cuts when you're talking about public safety or the need for those types of services that are out there. I think that's a tough one, but hopefully right now what's happening is causing us to really dig in and take a closer look at these things and maybe address what is, I think, probably a systemic problem as well, and certainly one that has not been easy to solve.
Yeah, there's one other issue just I want to bring up briefly, and that's that a lot of police, for example, are able to work for private employers while they're police and get paid overtime, and the money isn't coming out of the entity that employs them, but that extra work still factors into burnout and exhaustion and a whole variety of other issues when people are just working too much.
I mean, just simply, does anybody in this audience really want to be pulled over or accosted at a public facility where police have been hired to provide security by a police officer who has worked now 23 consecutive hours? This is not going to go well.
Yeah.
This is just not going to go well. People burn
Yeah.
out and people break down.
And also that brings up again the problem, the issue of documenting how much people are working so that and including those off-duty hours as well, so that the situation with individual employees.
Okay, now 2 more steps, and then we'll move along. The first is actually 3 steps. The first is if the folks out there in the audience have questions that they would like to share and ask from our panelists, they should be thinking about that right now. And before we go to that, if Linda or Catherine have any just very brief closing thoughts, things that haven't been covered, or things that or a story about your kids, who in our case are my kids.
Oh, I'd love to talk about that. I'm not sure how much we've talked about comp time. I just think that's interesting because it's not coming out of the budget, but it is going to add to overtime because you get time and a half extra time if you take comp time, and then that means cascading overtime.
Yeah, that's a really good point, Catherine. And I do think that comp time gets overlooked frequently. And a lot of times comp time isn't accounted for in the budget. And so you're not getting a true picture of how much overtime is really costing a city, state, county when you look at that. So I agree with you. Comp time is overlooked far too much.
Great. And do we have now if there are any
Well-
questions, or do we have time for questions?
Yeah, hey, Catherine and Rich, and we can let you kind of finish up your comments there. So, but whenever you're ready, I'm going to call on some people to ask questions.
Well, why don't we do that right now?
Well, I just want to say this has been a fascinating conversation. I have sat down and looked at the spreadsheets in my 4 more days of overtime and know that it's so layered. It's budget, it's politics, it's sometimes it's strategic, as you guys talked about here. Sometimes it is cost saving. So I am just on the edge of my seat. I don't know if you could see this about your guys' conversation on this. So I really appreciate this. But we're going to go first to Bob, and we're going to ask Bob to ask his question of our panelist. Hey, Bob.
How are you? Just one comment first. We were talking about hiring during the pandemic. NeoGov had done a little bit of research on it just after it first started. And if you recall, the gap between open positions and applicants for the public sector, state and local, was about 50%. In the first month, I think it was in March, I think we looked at it, and it was up over 80% gap. So there was a drop off in the number of open positions, but there's even a greater drop off in the number of applicants. So it is concerning. We've also been looking at the positions that are easy to fill and hard to fill, and I'm wondering if you looked at that to see if there's a correlation between the overtime pay and those that are hard to fill versus those that they can easily fill if they were to post those open positions.
Yeah, I think there's an absolute connection between hard to fill positions and overtime. Police dispatchers, that's a good example. You just can't fill those positions. You end up having to ask people to work mandatory overtime, and mandatory overtime sort of introduces a whole different negative set of issues, because you hear about people wanting overtime, but a lot of people who want a strong work-life balance don't want overtime. They want to be able to go to their children's school events and be home with their children.
Or they don't want the overtime to come where the overtime frequently seems to come, being a highway patrolman with the 12 to 8, 12 midnight to 8 in the morning shift. This is not the time of day that you want to be pulling people over.
Yeah, but hard to fill positions are definitely an issue.
Well, and especially in departments of correction, sorry, Bob, especially in departments of correction, we saw this in the state of Texas. Even though they are closing some of their facilities, what they're doing is they're closing, but they're not changing their overtime budget at all. They're actually keeping their overtime budget because they know there's no way that they're not going to have to pay overtime because they don't have enough people to fill the positions that they need in those correctional facilities. And so even though they might be closing some of them, it's not really changing the impact over time.
It's interesting. We've looked at some of this work ourselves too, and have seen safety, for instance, corrections, police officers, those type of people, and we'll help them fill those positions, and they'll get down, let's say they have 12 open positions, they'll fill the first 8 relatively easily, and they'll just stop. They won't try to fill the last 4. Politics come into play, and they really don't have an interest in trying to fill those positions. They want to pay overtime to certain people, as we've talked about, the politics aspect.
Yeah,
Thank you
so much, Bob, about that. What you guys are looking at and what we're hearing. I think you also brought up a great point. Public safety corrections, even when you are able to hire a new class, it's not as simple as putting them right in, because they have to go through 4 months of training, and then you have to, so even to backfill, when you're backfilling those hard positions, it's going to take time to get them in. So it's not a quick fix or a quick turnover.
And back to the point about, overtime is usually an operating budget expense that you can hide, whereas you can't have to get legislative approval possibly to fill an open position or to expand your workforce. So that's not going to be happening probably for a lot of states right now.
Well, thanks, Bob. And I'm seeing so many great faces in front of me. Kayla, will you pull up the chat to see if anyone wants to go next on the chat? Let's see, we have, it says Deputy Director Statewide Personnel from Illinois. Do you want to ask that question? And if so, we can unmute you and spotlight you to ask your question of our presenters today. So if our kind of production team will spotlight Deputy Director Illinois, we will get them. There you are. Hi, good to see your face.
Hi, everyone.
Yeah.
No, I really don't have a question, but I have more of some comments.
Yeah.
So I am again, Deputy Director for the state of Illinois. I was Chief of Staff for a couple of municipalities in Illinois as well as in Connecticut, and I manage the budget for public safety. And I just want to make some comments, particularly with the last one for Bob and NeoGov. Sometimes, in general, positions right now are very difficult to fill because of COVID. And when they're civil service positions, you have to test and you have to come into a testing center. So now that we have all this social distancing, it's now a strategy for testing. So now you have to plan how many people can come into a center. So it's really slowed down recruitment tremendously. It's very difficult now because you have to test, whether it's streets and sand or public safety and or fire, you have to do the testing for it. I also like to make a comment about the overtime budget with public safety. Taxpayers come to city council meetings and ask for protection. And their biggest oomph, if you will, is they want to make sure that they're protected by police. They want to make sure that they're protected by fire. And that's why you tend to see these overtime budgets escalate for public safety because the community just demands the public safety. So that's why you see the uptick in that, and it just kind of stays high all the time. To the point of the overtime budget, and people actually work this overtime and they consider that overtime as a part of their income. So someone made a comment earlier that they work overtime when it's really not strategically necessary to work the overtime, but they sign up for it because it is a part of their base income, if you will. So I just wanted to make a few comments towards that, given my experience. No real questions for the group, but I certainly think from a municipal, city, local, state standpoint that we're all on track.
Yeah, and that's a really good point as well. I think on the politics side of that, where it becomes a part of their income, I saw this in a couple of cities where then how do you go about making that reform? So, there were a lot of talk about overtime abuse in the police department and these large salaries, but now that has become the way they live. So they've adjusted their lifestyle to that. And so there's this concern from the political aspect of it. In this case, it was in the mayor's office, trying to determine, are you going to be the one who's going to come in and all of a sudden be very disruptive to those people's lives? And so, that is a hard thing. If you go from making, $250,000 a year to making $80,000 a year, that's a pretty dramatic impact to your life and to how you've adjusted. And so it's not as simple as just coming in and just wiping the slate clean. There are lives that are impacted by this, right or wrong.
Yeah, that's absolutely true. So a lot of this is in the collective bargaining agreements. So they typically have unlimited overtime. And if you were to take away that overtime, that then now becomes a grievance and can go to arbitration, because a precedent has been set right now with regard to allowing them to make the monies that they make. And typically they earn those monies through seniority. So it's your senior people who typically make the most money because they get first bite at the apple, if you will. Right. So it all becomes a bargaining issue at the end of the day, and it's really hard to take it away once it actually starts.
Can I throw in a follow-up question on this? I'm one of the facilitators, and so I'm selfishly asking this question. My brother's a police officer, actually north of the border in Canada, but he certainly factors into their family budget over time. But we're here in NASCA's Richmond, Virginia studios. Black Lives Matter has been a real center here, and there has been a sort of civic discussion about paying police overtime to be engaging in ways that are seen to be not appropriate by large elements of the citizenry. In those city council meetings, are you now also seeing people challenging police being paid overtime, sort of related to BLM and everything else that's going on?
Well, I personally haven't sat in a city council meeting, but with COVID, a lot of people are not physically in city council meetings, and I'm not sure if they've actually started the Zoom calls for the meetings, but I haven't seen it yet. So I guess COVID's got to flatten. The line needs to flatten a little bit more for people to start coming back into the council meetings. So I would be interested in seeing how that actually rolls out, but keeping in mind that the Black Lives Matter movement is a civil issue and you have to have civil order. And with civil order comes policing and fire.
So the irony being that as the movement is to sort of defund and restructure police budgets, actually the civic order is extending those budgets, at least temporarily in the short term.
Right. The talk that I've heard is not so much, I've heard people with the cry out for defunding, but I think they want to reallocate. So as opposed to defund the police departments, they want to reallocate those monies into sensitivity training. So that's kind of what I'm hearing on my side.
That's great.
Well, that's all really terrific stuff. We're kind of coming to our last couple of minutes. On behalf of, first of all, let me thank you so much. You know, if we had known you were out there, we would have had you on the panel. So really, my great thanks to you. My thanks on behalf of myself, Catherine, Linda, the panel, to NASCA and Kronos for making this possible. We hope it was of some use to the people in the audience. I'd like to now kind of pass the baton, if that's what it is, over to Jamie to kind of bring us on now.
Thank you so much. I mean, and I love this conversation we're having. We're trying to recreate what we do in person, which sometimes is so hard, but this back and forth is what we do in our in-person meetings, really hearing from people, both our private sector and our public sector. So I love this back and forth. It looks like everyone is coming back from breakouts. Welcome, welcome. I'm seeing so many faces. I'm seeing Jen, I'm seeing Lisa, I'm seeing Dan, I'm seeing Scott, I'm seeing Bob, I'm seeing David. So good to see you guys. I hope those breakouts, you guys got to see someone that if we were meeting in person, got to connect with people around the country, got to talk to some of our speakers, both Barrett and Green, as well as our Kronos partners. So what we're gonna do right now is we're gonna call on a couple of our facilitators to just give me a high level, what were you guys talking about in your breakouts? So I'm actually gonna call on, I was in Ray's breakout, so we're gonna go ahead and spotlight Ray and unmute Ray. There you are, Ray, and just high level, what did you guys talk about in your room?
We talked about quite a bit, but I don't want to take the whole spotlight here because Lisa was really instrumental in taking all the notes.
Okay. Well,
so if you unmute her as well, I'd love that.
So we'll spot Lisa. You took those notes. We're going to spotlight you and unmute you, and we're going to kind of hear what you guys talked about.
Okay, so we had a lot of good states. We have 13 participants. Overall, they have done well in managing the partnership between government and local municipalities with the employees, really to open the communication line of how to manage this COVID situation and overtime, and then providing that life-work balance. Some of the states have been very proactive in starting that communication, and there are also some very tangible measurements that they're putting in terms of metrics, right? It's all based on outputs, which is the second thing that we've noticed. What are the objectives? Have you hit them? And then also the more tactical is the third aspect. You've heard about walking around the water cooler, walking around the office. The situation now is doing these quick 15-minute check-ins to do engagement with your employees very quickly, very easily. And you can pop those in for maybe 40 employees, 5 a day or 5 throughout the week, just to check in to see how they are doing. To really build that human connection, which is probably you're not getting in person when you're in the office. And there is also things to consider going forward, right? Most people in one state, California, have found 84% would like to continue teleworking. So Daniel brought up a really good point in terms of how is this going to affect culture? Because a culture of an organization starts from the point of hitting the submit application button to the recruitment, to the interview, to the onboarding, and then the organization mission, the vision, and also how the kind of people that are working together also will change the dynamics of a workplace culture. So those are things to think about going forward.
And managing the outcomes too, I think Daniel had brought up, which I thought was just great. A lot of states have to make that change to focus on outcome management.
Yeah, thank you both Lisa and Ray. It sounds like your group got going, and thanks to Dan Kim for really leading and telling us some of the stuff going on in California. So the next up, we have either Bob or Glenn. You guys were leading the next group. Let's see, we're going to go ahead and spotlight Bob and highlight you, and you can let me know who is reporting out from your group.
I'm not sure Glenn's still on. I think he may have
Okay.
dropped off.
That's all you
Jahan can jump in though as well. What we heard from our great group was that controls are in place to be sure overtime's just not happening without a prior approval, and consider other options before overtime is approved. But for the most part, they're not seeing any increase with telework or the pandemic. The work is getting done. The workforce is doing a great job. And in fact, in some cases, examples were given where they've stepped up and have gone above and beyond to be sure their work is being recognized as they're out of sight, with their supervisors. So overall, not a lot of change. Had some cases of sick leave being taken for COVID purposes, but not a big change in the number of requests for sick leave or bereavement time off, or having to deal with other issues like child care or parent care. So overall, it's staying pretty close to what it was.
Fascinating, kind of that it's staying the same. So the next one, we're going to spotlight Jen Dowd, and either you or, I don't know if David or Dirk was leaving, but I'm going to go ahead and spotlight you and let you know what happened in our group.
Sure. Yeah, no problem. So we had a really good conversation, really focused on the employees being home. We tried to take the public safety conversation aside and focus on those other employees. And I'm looking through my notes right now, and it's, bringing people back is all about bringing them back safe. So you have to look at, maybe keeping people remote for a little bit longer is important. How do you do that? How do you bring them back safe? But also, how do you allow people to take care of their families, right? Because we talked a little bit about the school situation and how people are now going to be in a situation where their kids are home for longer than we thought. It was a really good point somebody brought up, like, this was not supposed to last for a long time, right? In everybody's mind back in March, this was going away within a month or two. And now we're faced with the reality that this is longer and longer. And we have to kind of make some of these concessions a little more permanently, at least for the time being. We did talk a little bit too about some of the challenges of really identifying still who's essential and who's non-essential when you're bringing people back, especially into large buildings.
Yeah, thank you so much, Jen. Anytime I get to see you, I miss seeing you in person, but you guys are really thought leader in this space, being essential versus not essential, really providing empathy. I'm learning so much from you. So with that, we are wrapping up today. So we do really value the feedback. So we'll give a few more seconds to write us if this was a 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, how valuable this was. All right, now let's do the next poll. How engaging was it? Was this interactive? Was this lively? Were you staying in tune? Were you engaged and interactive? We really don't want our sessions to just be us talking at you. We want this to be something that you are engaged in. So go ahead and rate that 1 to 5. How engaging was this session? And I'm just gonna, not yet, you are still polling, but I'm gonna let Scott Bollinger know that you are up next to wrap us and take us home while people are finishing. So while people are finishing, I just want to thank everyone that's on the call today. I want to thank Kronos, both Jen Dowd, and I want to thank both Catherine and Rich for your guys' thought leadership and partnership over the years. Both of you guys have been longtime partners in NASCA. I miss seeing you guys in person, but thank you so much for being with us today. So with that, I'm going to hand it over to Scott.
Thanks, Jamie. Again, I'd like to echo the comments to thank the sponsors, our work group for putting this summer series together. We're also working on a fall series. Also our presenters, Catherine, Richard, and Linda, thank you for your time and effort, and also for the NASCA staff to help pull us all together, because we all miss being in person. We all would have liked to have gone to Sacramento this fall. We would have liked to have been in Indiana in the spring, but we know that that's not feasible. But that time will come, so I look forward to that. And thank you all. We hope you continue to participate in the series. Have a great day.
Thank you, everyone. And we are going to play our music and we are going to see you out. Great to see everyone.